Ladies and gentlemen, we are beginning our next panel. I have a real pleasure to introduce to you our distinguished panelists. I will start with my close right, Benoit d'Aboville, former French ambassador to NATO, Warsaw, Prague. As a career diplomat, he also spent a lot of time in many other capitals, and now Vice President of Fondation pour la Recherche Stratégique, pardon my French. Next, Bogdan Klich, Deputy Minister of National Defense, Minister of National Defense, Senator, Euro-parliamentarian. Thank you very much for joining us today. Dr. Ulrich Speck, career, I would say, think tanker, expert on German foreign policy, worked for Friede, Elcano, and these days is with German Marshall Fund of the United States. And Reka Semerkeni, former ambassador of Hungary to the United States, advisor to ministers and foreign ministers, prime ministers, and today vice president of the Center for European Policy Analysis. Welcome. Thank you very much for joining us today. We have a great panel that will touch upon many issues that were already mentioned, but we will try to framework this in a little bit different way. We will use the expertise of our panelists to address the issue of transatlantic bond in the multipolar world, the future role of NATO. And before I ask questions to our panelists, I will introduce two important notions that will hopefully help us as a point of reference during the discussion. First thing, obviously, is the strategic situation, right? That after the collapse of the USSR, the strategic situation completely changed, or it changed to a substantial degree that some people started to question the relevance of NATO and its, whether it should survive, whether it should enlarge. It has already been mentioned today as well. So actually the alliance had to be rediscovered. If we know from theory and history why alliances work or do not work, you need to have a certain common interest. The alliance needs to address the security issues of all its members, so they are interested in keeping it alive and credible. So this is why it had to transform, it had to broaden its mission. It couldn't be focused only on deterrence and defense. It had to broaden its mission to crisis management, which was already an issue between Europeans and the United States, even during the Cold War. The Americans were not only asking for bigger defense spending in Europe, but they were also asking Europeans to be more engaged in providing security out of area. So those people who were behind this NATO transformation and enlargement, they knew that without broadening its function, it will not work. It will not serve the interests of its members, with the biggest member that offered security guarantees to European allies in 1949. So this was the transformation, the broadening of its mission. And of course, the collective defense and deterrence, crisis management was also complemented with another mission, cooperative security. In just human words, it's just like cooperating with other countries that are not members of the alliance and potentially can even be your adversaries. So we have those three missions. And another issue that I would like to introduce is the political cohesion of the alliance. So for the alliance to be credible, to work, the countries need to have a certain common strategic interests. And in some areas, of course, they have different interests. In some areas, they have common interests. The important issue is that the strategic common interest is bigger than some differences in minor issues. And with this, I am addressing my first question to Senator Klich, who was Deputy Minister of National Defense in 1999 when Poland was joining NATO, and in 2000, and then from 2007 to 2011 when Poland was engaged in Afghanistan. I would like to know how, after this change of the strategic situation in Europe, enlargement of NATO, how do you see that a mid-sized country like Poland can influence the NATO cohesion if we look at the cohesion through the prism of actually transatlantic bond, not the cohesion between Greek and Turkey or Iceland and UK, but rather between Europe and US. Mid-sized country, do we have necessary tools to influence this, this cohesion? How can we, how have we demonstrated that we are also a country that can be useful for American security interest, not only interest, but sense of security, that we are providing the security for the alliance?
Thank you very much for the invitation and for this opportunity to talk about such issues. Thank you, Mr. Dembski, as the president of PISM. Thanks a lot for GMF to organize this session. But at the very beginning, I will say that I don't have any hope that Poland could replace Washington as a leader of the alliance. I do not have such a hope, although there are several tools that we can use even in such a different situation, I mean in such different circumstances within NATO, comparing with the situation 20 years ago when we entered this community. Because 20 years ago, it was clear that there is a leadership of the United States, that there is a wish of the US for Europe to contribute more, but in much better organized form. I keep in mind the position of the United States and NATO expressed during the Washington summit, just after St. Malo meeting between President Chirac and Prime Minister Tony Blair, when the proposal of establishment of ESDP was politically submitted, but before the meeting of the session of the European Union in 1999 that approved that political solution, beginning the life of European security and defense policy. The situation was clear at that time. Now we have new factors, completely new factors. First of all, this is the internal situation within the alliance, that President Trump suggests Europeans not only to take more responsibility for its security, but proposes that in a much more transactional way. I mean, approach of President Trump is purely transactional to the cooperation with the Europeans that should be, according to the Article 5, a commitment. A political commitment. So those who undermine the political consequences of the Article 5 of the Washington Treaty right now express their doubts in a clear way. And we have to try to find such the instruments that can be used to reinforce Article 5 within the alliance, because this is the chance for the countries of the eastern flank facing so visibly the aggressive posture of Russian Federation. And I see I see three groups, three categories of instruments that can be used by countries like Poland with this geopolitical location and with means that we have. The first one, this is the doctrine. The doctrine in which, since 2010, the first chapter is devoted to defense and deterrence. Let's keep in mind that we have the Lisbon strategic concept still with three chapters. The first one devoted to reinforcement of deterrence and defense. And in this chapter, we have also three instruments that were introduced according to our wish. One of them, these are exercises and training. The second one, this is institutional cooperation between allied partners. And the third one devoted to cohesion of our activities. Of course, we used those anchors within this doctrine, not recently, but since the year 2010, when Polish side was an initiator of the first steadfast yes exercise that were the first in the history, Article 5 exercises on the territory of Poland, Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, in this part of Europe, on the eastern flank. And this process goes on. That's why this is the instrument that can be used also in future. We have the doctrine with those solutions that are incorporated in this doctrine. Yeah? By the way, one could say that the third chapter of this doctrine is not still valid, because this is devoted to cooperative model of security that was blown up by Russian aggression against Ukraine, that doesn't exist in reality, because it was based on the assumption that that the dialogue with partners is better than confrontation with the enemies, that it is better to cooperate than to confront each other. And there is a wish of some partners of review the doctrine. But still, this doctrine exists, and the first chapter gives us the chance as a basis for our expectations. The second one, this is institutional structure of the alliance, in which such solutions like VJTF, like reinforced NRF after the Newport Summit, like enhanced forward presence or tailored forward presence after the Warsaw Summit. And let's not forget about it, also 430s that were presented during the last Brussels Summit play a crucial role for reinforcement of our deterrence, or the deterrence of Central European countries, and may play the role in future in our hands as the country as mid-sized country of the alliance. The fourth one, these are military. This is the military staff that is educated, and especially high commanders of allied countries that are educated in this atmosphere, in this mood of the strong commitments of Article 5. Yeah? This is the staff that perceives seriously and understands the political role of Article 5. I would base, especially in the turbulent times, mainly on high commanders of the US Army that understand what is the difference between commitment and transaction.
And this is pretty obvious that it is Polish national interest, and there is bipartisan consensus on this, that NATO should remain relevant as far as its core mission is concerned, like deterrence and defense. But at the same time, as a mid-sized country, do we have other tools to influence NATO cohesion if it needs to act out of area? If you were, when you were a minister, we were in Afghanistan, proportionally to our size, which was pretty heavy burden on Polish armed forces. But we were not engaged, for example, in Libya. Maybe even today there is a discussion whether it was because of political considerations, or maybe we did not have anything to put on the table because we lacked capabilities. Very briefly, because our panel is pretty short, but aren't you afraid that we don't have necessary tools to influence NATO cohesion when it will need to provide something more to the south to act out of area, and we will become a hostage of our geographic location? We will only say that, okay, we need to deter and defend against Russia, but the allies will say, okay, but we need to refocus to the south. If you do something in the south, so we will release some resources and we can help you here in this region. Will we have those resources? Have we developed such resources?
To some extent, you answered your question, because our contribution to both, to 4 operations out of area, beginning with Bosnia and Herzegovina through Kosovo mission, mainly in Afghanistan, but also in Iraq, although it was not the operation under the NATO flag. This is not only our insurance, national insurance, but this is our contribution that can be put on the table, saying that yes, during the 2 decades of out-of-area operations of alliance, we did our job well. We did our job well. So this is this kind of contribution that can be used, as a kind of signal that, as a kind of signal that our approach to the cohesion of NATO should be perceived in a serious way. That's first. Secondly, this is what I described as the position of the commanders, but also of experts from NATO. I regret that Jim Mattis is not still a Defense Secretary of the United States, because it was a person that understood very well, all the commitments stemming from the Article 5 of the Washington Treaty. And I know what I say. But in the US, both documents, strategic documents, 2018 National Security Strategy and the Defense Strategy, there is a clear description of main challenges for the United States. And one of those main challenges, this is Russia. This is aggressive posture of Russia. So our mutual understanding with those who share the opinions expressed in those 2 conceptual documents can be a basis, for our better influence on the future decisions of NATO concerning cohesion of the alliance.
Thank you very much. And if we come back to this strategic situation, which, for experts who deal with international relations, it's just mind-boggling how fast things are changing and how quickly we are moving from the times when the security environment was relatively stable and friendly to times when actually you cannot exclude that there will be a military confrontation in Europe. We have growing China, becoming more assertive in the South China Sea, US refocusing to Asia Pacific, and even if the new strategy, American strategy, indicates that both China and Russia needs to be treated as potential rivals. If you compare the potentials of those two countries, you can be worried that, you know, that Americans will direct resources to Asia Pacific, especially if the risk of the crisis grows. At the same time, we have the pressure from the south, migration, terrorism that will not go away for the foreseeable future. In such a situation, how Europe can influence the American perception, not only through increasing defense spending, although I know that this is very important, and this is why our American allies have stressed this for many years, if not decades. But referring to what Madeleine Albright said, that, you know, for American politicians, it's very difficult to go to their constituencies and explain to the common people why they, you know, the American soldiers need to defend countries that the names are very difficult to pronounce. How, as a former ambassador to the US, you know, you see that our ability to influence the political debate and American perception of Europe?
Thank you, and thank you very much for this discussion. Really, I think as we can see around, this is really the hardcore of those who are interested in the transatlantic relations that have stayed. And I really appreciate the attention and the large attention to the panel. I think this is, I would like to respond to your question more as an analyst and as a representative of the Center for European Policy Analysis, because Central Europe, in general, I think has a lot of experience in this question and a lot of valid experience. There is a short-term, a tactical answer to this question, and there is a strategic answer. And I think we have to be sort of having both of them in mind. The tactical answer to this approach is very clearly rooted in this cooperation that we have demonstrated in the region, which is, and we have seen in the region, which is the Central European cooperation. As a region, the understanding of the security challenges and the priorities, it is a very clear strategic priority for the US as well to respond. So I think it makes a lot of sense. It also makes a lot of sense for the region to cooperate on identifying, so not just the how, the cooperation itself, but the what, the issues of what to present to Washington are better understood if it comes from the regional approach. And I think in the what, which is of course the central question also, we have a list of issues that we can see that need to be put on the priority list for the transatlantic cooperation. We have, just to name a few, you know, the speeding up of the mobility of forces in the European continent, for instance, across the borders and over the distances. We have not worked on that at all. Increasing the effective personnel management of the alliance as such. Improving the alliance level cooperation and communication is definitely there. But what we could see is with the rise of the social media, rise of Russian propaganda, Russian narrative, energy, cybersecurity challenges, what we can see is a hybrid threat environment. So what we have to do is propose what is legitimate, and I think we have to say it out loud, that this is a hybrid containment strategy that is needed to respond to these challenges. So we have to develop the elements of this hybrid containment strategy to be able to handle these challenges in the future. All of this, I think, is a list of very important priority points for all of us to be keeping in mind. But what is very important is to have the strategic understanding behind it, and that's what I would like to underline primarily. What we have to see is that the strategic conditions of 1997 and the early 90s probably have fundamentally changed. That period is over. That era of sort of post-Cold War era in which we had a more or less a quiet, 2 decades of thinking and reorganizing our future priorities is gone. And what we have to see is that there is now, we're at the beginning of an era of a new geostrategic environment, a new geostrategic great power competition for the 21st century. So what we have to understand is what this new geostrategic competition is going to entail for the future, because that's how we have to prepare for this. And in this regard, of course, the discussion on the challenge that a rising China will mean is priority for the US, and I will come back to this priority list in the first place. The concern that this will mean the reorientation of resources is legitimately there. But I think what we have to keep in mind as Central European analysts and as Transatlantic Alliance is that the neglecting the strategic deficiencies in one area, will not help the alliance to prepare for a confrontation or a challenge in another area. Quite the opposite. The priority of this new geostrategic great power competition, which we see just makes it even more important and more urgent, more sort of immediate, to focus on getting our own house in order and making sure that both the transatlantic community as such and the weakened eastern flank of the alliance is a problem, and that we have to focus on solving these ones just because we are ready, we want to get ready for the 21st century's major challenges. And in this, I would like to underline, I think there's what I termed for myself 6 points to go through and to keep in mind in our preparation. I call this the noise, the cause, the shift, the lag, the gap, and the race. So the noise is exactly what you said, Wojciech. The noise is that wherever you look in the global scene, you see problem. Middle East, Turkey, Iran, Iraq, China, wherever, Russia, Ukraine, there is a list of problems. But the noise should not hide from ourselves the real problem and the real issue. We are, what is under challenge is this transatlantic cooperation that has been the value that saved the Western values throughout the Cold War, and that managed for us to get ready to join into after 1990. So I very much believe that the cause is very clearly there, having gone through the noise. The cause is that we have to get the Transatlantic Alliance ready for the challenges of the 21st century. That's the issue. Without the transatlantic cooperation, there will be no proper response to the challenges of the 21st century. And without the transatlantic cooperation, we will not be able to handle these challenges. So there's a shift in the geostrategic priorities, which we can see. So from the noise, the cause, we're now to the shift point. The shift is that there is an understanding of the geostrategic confrontation in many parts of the world with some lags. The lagging of the understanding is a serious problem. If there is a lag of response or of being aware of this strategic challenge, which we can see in the transatlantic community, Washington may be more ahead than some European capitals. Even the European capitals, some are ahead, some are lagging behind. The threat is that if we don't get ourselves on the same page, the lags will become gaps. Gaps in capability, gaps in political decision-making, and gaps in cohesion. And that brings me to the last point, which is the times race, the race. Because what is really question is that some of these political forces that are seen as increasingly dominating the discourse as a result of this strategic shift, a revisionist Russia or an emerging China, are not just active, they are proactive. And what is happening is that a lot of the pieces of the puzzle are put down already. And the question is, by the time that we catch up in the lag of understanding the shifting priorities and the shifting geostrategic security environment, will we still be in a position to respond to them at all? Or will they beat us just in time, just in the question of, they managed to put those elements down before we were ready to react to this. So I think we have to take this very seriously. And what is very important, and thank you very much for organizing these events, is to do more of this, to have a very intensive transatlantic security dialogue, which I think is the greatest challenge for the years ahead of us. And then I leave the floor to the questions.
Referring to this, concept of lagging behind, I think that, you need to be proactive to shorten this lag, actually. So you need to have some kind of communication strategy, how you communicate to the Americans that Europe actually, it's been mentioned a lot of times that, Article 5 was revoked after the September 11, the first time, and only time in history, in NATO history. But we, probably most of us have the experience, definitely I have this experience, that during the Afghanistan, even with a huge effort from the side of Europeans, our engagement there was overshadowed by the discussions of, that not all allies are doing what they should be doing, that there are some caveats, that we have problems with equipment, etc., etc. And although it was just like 50,000 allied troops plus Americans there, it's been overshadowed, I think. So we lost this narrative. Maybe not, but this is my impression. And this is one of those areas where I think we should look for some corrections, and at least at the European level we should be more effective. Ambassador Daboville, France was actually, has been afraid of the United States withdrawing from Europe since the end of the Second World War. Right? This hasn't materialized yet, hopefully, and will never materialize, but we can discuss, the political cohesion at a time when the security situation is pretty benevolent and quiet, but whether there is this cohesion you can experience and you can see at a time of a crisis. And I think that we are going through such crisis which should help us assess whether NATO is coherent, or whether this threat perceptions and strategic interests of nation states that form the alliance will be so different that there will be fractures and it will crack. The pressure is on demonstrating that the glass is half full rather than half empty. But you, as a realist, French, how do you see it?
Well, first, thank you for Sławomir Dębski and the GMF for having me the opportunity to go back to Poland. In fact, I left Poland for NATO, so it was a natural move. Celebrations are usually a good way to be happy about what we have achieved and to look to the challenge of the future. And I remember that the Poles are always saying at the end of a celebration of a birthday, "100 lat." And I think that the Polish delegation should be at the next summit in Brussels, begin to sing that and to try to push Trump to sing for 100 lat also.
It would mean only next 30 years for NATO.
Okay, but
let's change it into 200 years.
Okay, I will not speculate about 30 years, but look, in the 2020 we will have three main events. First, an American election, which will be important for NATO. You will have also the beginning of a succession discussion of Putin. And third, probably China will reach equal level of economic GNP as the US, and that will be a shock for the American public opinion and a kind of development of what Allison called the two-seeded complex. But if I try to see what will be the main trend for NATO in the next future. I will see four of the first one is that NATO will remain the framework of an enduring transatlantic relationship. There is no doubt about that. Nobody in France is challenging that. But at the same time, there will be a growing importance of the European pillar. Whether you call it autonomous strategy or something else, or European identity on defense, it is the same aim. It is to allow European military forces to better cooperate in order to be in a position of sharing the burden better. So I was slightly troubled when the former minister at the previous panel said the West is looking about autonomous strategy in order to secede from the US, and the East, the Eastern country like Poland, are looking for bilateral deal. I think it will be the worst solution for NATO. If NATO began to be on a kind of regional division and bilateral deal, that will be really bad for the cohesion of NATO. Already the EU is helping NATO. You mentioned the mobility. The mobility is a very important priority. The military Schengen thing is something that the EU will pay for NATO mobility. Nobody knows that already the EU has paid NATO 30 million in order to modernize the AWACS.
One of the most important common assets of NATO to defend its airspace.
Only common asset of NATO. Nevertheless, I think that for that, the issue of reinforcing NATO through EU cooperation is something which now we are beyond the dispute, I think. I think the second trend is that compared to the 80s and the 90s, the NATO expeditionary alliance will fade away. Because after
so we don't need to invest.
No. After Iran and after, I'm sorry, about Iraq and Libya, there is no mood within the public opinion to get into that. But that doesn't mean that military means are useless in order to help to solve crises. The French have now 10,000 people in Mali, boots on the ground. There were people going in the mountain of the Tibesti in order to chase Islamists. That is something which you need, and that you cannot have a substitution by technological weaponries. You still need boots on the ground, and that we will do that not through NATO, because there will be division, but we will do that by the coalition of the willing. The mission determines the coalition. And there is nothing wrong about that. We have, you mentioned Libya, we have done that. Now, the third thing, which is that NATO will remain a nuclear alliance. I think it's important to mention because so far it has not been mentioned. It is a challenge because you have part of the public opinion which has some difficulty with nuclear weapons. But
nuclear taboo. You just mentioned nuclear.
But really, both France and UK are modernizing their nuclear forces at a price, and they contribute to the alliance. Ottawa Declaration, 1974. The Americans are also investing quite a lot in the next years for modernizing their triad. So that will remain an element in the alliance picture. I think the fourth element, which has been spoken quite a lot before, is that NATO, one of the great NATO challenge would be to fight against the threat against its democratic institution. I think we have seen interference in election, we are seeing fake news, we are seeing cyber, and of course NATO and EU and every nation are now measuring the challenge, and they are making a lot of investment on that. We have increased tenfold the number of people which are working in the French Embassy, and we are participating to the NATO discussion on that. But it's raised a lot of questions which have not yet really been addressed. How we conciliate the fight against fake news and the freedom of our press. We are not going into a kind of propaganda war with China or Russia. How do we ensure that the social networks are not an element of disinformation? One of the obvious solutions will be to oblige the provider to check on the identity of the user. But that is go against the culture of Internet as we have seen now. So we have a lot of problems, but I think there is one guideline: we should not abandon our value in the fight against disinformation. So I think that will be one of the biggest challenges. Not only against Russia, China, and some other, but also within the alliance. And after all, we are an alliance of values, and it is quite important that we continue to do so.
This is a very important point, because we sometimes forget that NATO was founded in 1949 not only to deter Soviet Union from military aggression, but actually to strengthen the security of Western democracies and make them immune of political influence, political interference. And these days, you know, as you rightly said, fake news and propaganda, new information methods, that they can be more influential than communist parties in the 50s in Western Europe.
Just add something. I was really impressed by the fact that during this conference, all the time we were speaking about the 2% norm. Well, it's, as it was reminded, it's as old as Kennedy, Eisenhower, and so forth. There's a lot of... but this is a very, very rough parameter of capacity. And I think that already when the Italians are saying that fight against cyber threat should be added to the 2%, they have a point. But also when Mrs. Merkel proposed that stabilization expenditure should be also added to the 2%. This is a real point, because before, what we want is to prevent the crisis. We have in a lot of weak countries problem of institution, problem of immigration, problem of consequences of the climate change and so forth. But we should address that before it's become a hotbed for Islamic kind of crisis and so forth. So if we don't put money on preventing crisis, we are really missing our mission. And we are seeing now the Americans withdrawing from foreign aid. They are concentrating to military. But at the same time, it is only through multilateral foreign aid and development that we will be able to have the hope of a rather stable world.
It's a very, very important point, although it is a double-edged sword, because on one hand you need to remember that there are some other tools, not only military power, that can be effectively used to diffuse crisis at the early stage, but at the same time you need to have the tool to exert pressure on the allies to increase spending after so many years of cuts.
I will stop on that. I think the best incentive for increasing spending in NATO was thanks to Putin. We should thank Putin in Crimea and Ukraine. Yeah. He has wake up the alliance.
No, not all the allies, I would say, were woken up. Dr. Ulrich Speck, when we look at NATO as this is the alliance of sovereign states which have their national interests, and we all know from history that actually it was the West Germany that was supposed to be the central front, and it was one of the most important countries for effective deterrence during the Cold War. When NATO estimated that there was a threat of a surprise operation from Soviet Union with some 30 divisions, so Germany provided 12 of those divisions, which was a huge contribution to deterrence at the conventional level, of course, the role in nuclear deterrence. After France withdrew from integrated military structures, my hypothesis is that actually transatlantic bond was based on the relation of West Germany and UK with the United States, and this was the majority of the deterrence potential and political influence within the alliance. And now when you look at the Pew Research recently published how Germans perceive America and how Americans perceive Germany, you really see that there is a big problem, right? How serious will it be for NATO's cohesion in the coming decade?
Yeah, thank you for having me. And well, it's great to come here because here NATO is alive and kicking. It may have to do something with the fact that NATO is 20 years old here, while in the west of the continent it's 70 years old, so there's a bit of a difference. Germany is concerned about the future of NATO, and that has to do with Trump. I think Monsieur Dabouville, as you just said, Trump gave another lifeline to NATO. At least it revived NATO and made it look fresh and young again. But then Trump came, and this has been perceived as a shock by Germany. Germany, since Truman, had always presidents, American presidents, who had a German-friendly rhetoric. Even George W. Bush, did not turn against Germany the way Trump does. So it almost looked for a while that Germany became Trump's favorite enemy, at least someone to bash on Twitter. And I think this was a real shock to Germany, which relies on NATO guarantees, which relies on US security guarantees. Let's face it, you can call it NATO, but the core of it is the transatlantic relationship. And on US strategic leadership. In the 90s, enlargement, all driven by an American vision of Europe whole and free. And suddenly you have a president, and then you have even the episode with Schröder, Chirac, Putin, turning, testing the waters for a different kind of, I wouldn't call it alliance, but trying to a different figuration, let's call it like this. So, but the transatlantic alliance has survived all that, and there was no real problem, I would say. I mean, Bush II, 2005, 2009, with Condoleezza Rice as Secretary of State, that was again a love affair. And you may remember the pictures of George W. Bush massaging Angela Merkel's back in Heiligendamm at the G8 summit. So that was a love affair again, very unlikely with Trump. I mean, basically the conversation is broken between not only Berlin and Washington, but also Paris and Washington, and London and Washington. So there's a problem. This is a big shock for Germany, and the conversation in Berlin right now is much more about, do we have a plan B? What if? What if the security guarantee is not there anymore? And this concern has turned Germany to move towards France. There was always in Germany this second option, let's call it second option, the 50s, 60s, 70s. We all know that the European defense community was a real project in the 50s until the French Senate voted against it. Or that was option number one, because the French wanted it. And only if this project failed, Germany entered NATO. And now it's kind of rethink, in some circles, SPD circles, but broadly a sense that we need to strengthen our relationship with France, because ultimately that's the way for European defense, not because Germans want to get rid of Americans. We see. I mean, Germany was really a fantastic supporter of the whole deterrence and defense effort in the last years in response to what the Russians did in Ukraine. And so I think Germans are quite, in practical terms, very much behind this, but they are afraid. An American president, is turning against the crown jewels of German industry, the Mercedes, Volkswagen. That is scary. It's even more scary because we're living in a world of great power competition, where the Russians and the Chinese are also knocking on everybody's doors. So there is a great confusion, uncertainty. But I would say that in the last 1-2 years, Germans and French have tested the waters, how far they can go in cooperation. But what we could see that there is not much that unites them in terms of do we want European autonomy? What does it mean? Strategic autonomy. Of course, you can always argue, well, it's just about some operations in Mali. But if you use the term, it sounds much more ambitious than just some small operations complementing NATO. Germans are supportive of French operations in Africa, but it's not seen as a vital national interest, unlike in France. So there's a different threat perception. Germany is, in fact, much closer to Poland in its threat perception. It's all about Russia. It's about how to deal with Russia. And dealing with Russia can be deterrence, but it can also be Nord Stream 2. But this is what is the concern. This is what is in Germans' mind is the East. It's not so much the South, even with all the migration. Yes, there's a new effort. Merkel went to Africa, but it doesn't have the same urgency as everything that is happening in the East. The Visegrad 4 countries are are more important for the German economy than the trade with China is. So there is this concern, but there is also a recognition that there is no real plan B. Especially, and you mentioned nuclear deterrence, especially in the field of nuclear deterrence, there is just no candidate to replace the US deterrence. If Europe would, as we tried in the 50s, 60s, or discussed, especially in the 60s, and de Gaulle killed it, a joint European nuclear defense, or French-American, with Franz Josef Strauss at that time. So anything in that direction would not be able to replace the American guarantee because of credibility. Credibility in Warsaw, in Tallinn, in Moscow especially. So who would believe that a French-led European nuclear deterrent would be able, would have the same role or be able to replace the American guarantee. America has credibility because of the history of the Cold War and because of its size and global ambition. So I don't think that anybody in Germany thinks that there is anybody serious thinks that we should move ahead towards a European army that could replace NATO. And adding to this is also what François Eisbourg once called, one should not turn a hedge into a wedge. So if you try, if you try to build something, the Americans or Trump may just say, fine, okay, then finally we can go and focus on nation building at home. So I don't think it's an imminent project. I don't see this project anywhere among serious people. So at the moment we are just, muddling through, going ahead, trying to work with the French a little bit, just enough to make them happy, with the Poles, with the Americans, waiting for things to come. There's no big initiative on defense. There's the hope that the status quo can survive. But there's also the kind of sense of, well, things are changing. And personally, just to add this as a last comment, I think the real question is, are we moving towards this great power competition paradigm? And then what does it mean for NATO? What does it mean for Europe?
Yeah, I hope that we'll have a second round with the same question to all of you about this European strategic autonomy, which was again mentioned a number of times during this conference today. But this panel is pretty short. We have only 15 minutes left, so it depends on you whether you will be able just to address the issue in 2-minute comments, so then we will have time for one to questions. Okay, I can see that Ambassador Daboville is...
The issue of the European army is absolutely out of the question. And the French are certainly not willing to have a European army. We are willing to have a European pillar within NATO. And now the question is, in the past, we had experience in Bosnia at a time where the US was not interested. It was saying, Baker was saying, we don't have a dog in the fight of Bosnia. And we said at that time, it was not a question of nuclear or so forth. So we began to press the White House to get into Bosnia in order to ensure the credibility of the transatlantic relationship at that time, because it was in danger in Europe. Now, I don't think that we should oppose the priority of the South and the priority of the East. That is the kind of things which often one listens in Poland. We have challenge on both sides. I think that we have troops in the Baltic, in the rotational enhanced presence, and we are patrolling their sky and so forth. But that doesn't mean that we are not conscious of the problem of the security in the East. At the same time, we know that the Mediterranean, where the Russians are since Syria, have a base and so forth, is a problem. We know that the Maghreb and the Sahel are problematic and can create problems for the whole of Europe, not only with migration. So we have to address all those concerns in solidarity. And I don't think that solidarity is a question of geography. And I was shocked to listen to the minister at the previous challenge when he said we should shift German troops, US troops in Germany to Poland. Why it will be more efficient in terms of deterrence if they are in Poland or if they are in Germany, if we consider that there is a solidarity within the alliance.
But it's, Germany had exactly the same threat perception during the Cold War, and they wouldn't agree with the argument that they are safe with American troops in France, with all due respect. Okay, the same question to Senator Klich. European strategic autonomy, something that can strengthen the NATO cohesion and complement NATO by, for example, providing capabilities and giving another format of out-of-area operation, or something that would undermine NATO's cohesion?
For the time being, European strategic autonomy is a flag that can be put ahead of the European Union as a far-reaching objective. For the time being, we have to think about European reality. And European reality is that there are several tasks that have to be achieved. Because in the institutional framework of the European Union, we have mechanisms and tools that should be implemented to enhance security and defense policy of the European Union, CSDP. This is, in my opinion, the realistic goal for the community of the European nations, to enhance common security and defense policy of the European Union. After the crisis that CSDP survived, but was the longest crisis in its short life. I mean during last years since 2008. So if we survived, if CSDP exists, it is necessary to enhance it with existing institutional mechanisms. One of them, it is to go ahead with PESCO. I'm afraid that the current Polish government decided finally to join step by step PESCO projects. I regret because some years ago we were one of 3 countries proposing PESCO as a tool for enhancements of European policy. And I'm pretty sure that in the Polish interest it is to reinforce our involvement in the European Union's policy concerning security and defense. Secondly, so we have to go ahead with PESCO. We have to go ahead with operational HQ for the EU missions. Those missions that were enlisted in the so-called Petersburg tasks, in the list of Petersburg tasks. We are not able right now to do some kinds of those missions because we don't have at our disposal enough capabilities, and the lack of institutional capability that would be responsible for planning and conducting European larger scale missions, out of area missions, is one of our failure. So we have to create better functioning institutions. Thirdly, we have to describe the future of the battle groups that we have at our disposal since more than a decade. Finally, we should begin the discussion about the solidarity clause and the future of solidarity clause that was used after terrorist attacks in France, but it should be used in much more institutional way than it happened before. So there are several realistic tasks that we have to do, some steps that we really have to do if we want European Union's security and defense policy as a visible and effective tool, not only as a, let's say, paper manifestation of our willingness.
Thank you very much. And I can already see that we won't have time for questions, which I'm very sorry for, but we need to give 2 minutes to our 2 panelists. Reka, European strategic autonomy, strengthening, complementing NATO, or undermining its cohesion?
I think this is really a notion that lacks completely Any military capability as a foundation lacks political understanding, political consensus as a background for it, and is fundamentally very counterproductive. I think it's very efficient if we want to if we want to increase the noise, if we want to divert attention away from the strategic priorities, or if we want to sort of increase the massing of the scenery in front of us. What we have to see is the real priorities ahead of us. The lacks that we need to strengthen, the capabilities in the alliance itself, that we have touched upon a little bit, and the problems of, for instance, the unfinished, what we call at SIPA, the unfinished business of the enlargement process itself. Because we did extend, with the enlargement of the NATO member states, the treaty itself and the political cooperation and the political infrastructure of NATO. We did not extend the military infrastructure of the same alliance, and I very much believe that this is a discussion, and I very much was encouraged what Benoit said. I think this is something that is the priority discussion for the years ahead of us, to focus on, yes, would that and how would that strengthen alliance stability and security, to rethink the permanent positioning of US forces in the Central East European area. And I think these are the valid discussions, issues that we need to focus on, the mobility, the speed, the military Schengen. Yes, they are real issues ahead of us. Everything else is really just counterproductive.
Uli, and I want to ask the same question because you finished on this strategic autonomy as a plan B that does not exist, but the security reinsurance for Germany. But my question would be, if Germany is so worried with Trump policy, why they don't look at the real actions that were mentioned as well, that actually Americans are not going out from Europe, they are coming back, they are investing only in 2019 for $6.5 billion for infrastructure, for exercises, for being here in Europe. Maybe this is just like a political phenomena, but it does not tell us anything about the mood, in American political circles.
The Germans also have their mood, and the political psychology of a country is often a little bit weird, and we see rather, the country removing even from its very unambitious goals. We see the finance minister quarreling over even the 1.5 in 2021, I think. No, 5. Anyway, so this is the debate. But my fear is, and I think strategic autonomy, European army are terms that are counterproductive because they raise wrong expectations amongst friends and enemies, so to speak. So I would, just talk about the issues themselves and not give them fancy names that are misleading. But I think we talked about Trump. I think our real goal, and I think I can only congratulate Poland that it's so ambitious to move even to the 2.5%, because we need to demonstrate to the Americans that we are good allies, that we're interesting for them. I mean, we want something from them, which is mainly the nuclear umbrella. I mean, I think at the core, it boils down to this, among many other things, but without this, we couldn't, we wouldn't be able to deter Russia in the right way. But so, in order to keep it, we need to deliver something, and I'm afraid that we don't really have, the debate so clearly on realistic terms that this is a choice, and a choice we have to make here. Let's not give ammunition to those in the US who say this is a waste of money, and Poland is on a good way, and so I encourage your government to rebuild relations with Berlin, to make the case, to lobby these issues. That's important. The Polish voice has to be heard in Berlin. And the breakdown of conversation between those two capitals is damaging also the cause of NATO.
Thank you very much. I think we did a great job with this panel. Please join me in thanking our panelists.